This isn't just a podcast, it's a movement. The MiddleGround Mic is fighting for truth and unity. Subscribe now, support us today. Links are in the notes. Stand with us.
People say, and I tend to agree, that without, what happened with PT 109, he never would have been president. There's a certain mythology regarding PT 109 and what happened there on that night in August. His men were rescued. 2 were killed in the collision with the Japanese ship. They're either going to court-martial me or give me a medal. Why would they court-martial him? Well, before the crash, it was the only battle he was in. He wasn't actually in the battle. There's supposed to be a picket line to destroy Japanese shipping that was supposed to come through. So at some point, his men weren't alert. Few were sleeping, and he only had one engine going. And that's always been a controversy. They only had one engine going. Why did he only have one engine going? There's a certain reason for it.
Good afternoon, everybody. Welcome to the MiddleGround Mic, where we try to get outside of echo chambers and we like to talk about leadership, and lately unity has become a big thing for this show. Something that really stuck out to me was a book by Scott, I'm terrible last names. I don't want to Badler.
B-A-D and then R, yeah. Put it together.
Author of Becoming JFK. It's a huge narrative deep dive into one of the presidents that really was able to unify this country. And I think people need to, if you don't know history, you're doomed to repeat things that you shouldn't. And he is a representative of a lot of the things that we should try to repeat to some degree, and so I appreciate, what you're doing with that book, and, tell everybody a little bit about who you are.
Okay, yeah. Well, let's see. As I say, this book is the sequel to another book, and my own sort of interest in the Kennedys kind of goes all the way back. But actually, my first memory, I'm not the youngest man in the world anymore, so my first memory of the Kennedys actually has to do with Nixon. I can remember when I was on the playground and Election Day 1960, and I can just remember yelling "Nix on Nixon," against the Nixon supporters on Election Day. Nixon's sort of a word a second grader wouldn't know, but that's my first Kennedy memory. And then, from there, I guess I've always followed them. I lived on the East Coast for a while, so was able to kind of, I wouldn't say mix with the Kennedys, but I would go to the events at the Kennedy Library and see them at Harvard. But always had an interest in the Kennedys. Bobby Kennedy was my hero. So that's sort of a quick update on my interest in the Kennedys.
Yeah, Bobby Kennedy is definitely, I believe, Angel Network. It's a movie network, just did a movie on him. I have not seen it yet, but they, it advertises on my Facebook about 5,000 times a day. They're one of those small independent film companies.
Okay. I noticed there's a new book out on him also by Chris Matthews, who's a famous Kennedy author, just came out, and I guess there's going to be something on the Kennedy Library. So it keeps continuing today, and I saw where I just made it sort of connection there that 80 years ago, JFK won his first congressional seat in Massachusetts, and now his grandson is running in New York. So we'll see what happens there. He'll need some luck.
Yeah, the underestimated Kennedy, right? Because in your stuff, you kind of talk about he was the underdog per se of the family. One of the big things that I don't think that they talk a lot about whenever you talk about history in JFK is somebody like you that studies it, but his chronic illnesses, with Addison's disease, scarlet fever, his back issues. Some people may know about that. And I had read that, he was often hospitalized, missing school for long periods of time.
Yeah. The more I researched, the more I found about his illnesses and some sort of secret things he did just to keep him well. I mean, when he was at Choate, he broke the record for most days in the infirmary. So he had this autoimmune disease that sort of affected every part of his life. He had something called celiac disease. Now it's sort of affiliated with the, irritable bowel syndrome. So his stomach was always destroying him, and he'd go through these periods where he'd lose a lot of weight. He'd get hives, and it would happen again and again. So, I really admire his persistence for overcoming that. At one point, maybe he went a little too far. It's hard to say. During, he went to the Mayo Clinic, and he was getting ready to travel to Europe to be the eyes and ears of his father, as well as did the research for his own book. Steroids had just come into being. And so he made a decision to take steroids. They made a cut in his leg, and they put an implant of a steroid in there. And so that sort of carried him through his trip. and he used that also during the war. But it may have had some debilitating effects on his back. That maybe it destroyed his cartilage, they believe. So and it had some serious effects too. But he was certainly always, I think that made him live life one day at a time and wanted to make the most of life. Because I think he had a feeling that maybe he wouldn't live that long. And I was thinking would he have made it through a second term? I don't know. He was taking so many drugs at some point, very healthy, but at some point, I think something might have happened. But we'll never know.
Yeah, drugs are tough. I I know that a lot they have quite. The family had assumed Joe Jr. was kind of like the chosen one, kind of leaving him behind. And your research kind of showed he used humor and wit to kind of deflect people. I don't know if he was embarrassed or like what things like really got at him that he used that to kind of deflect it.
Yeah, that is sort of a myth, I think, that, well, I think up till age, whatever, 20, certainly the ambassador, the patriarch had tabbed the older brother, Joe Jr., grooming him to be president. After 20, all the evidence points to, and at the very end, by the end, Jack had passed his brother in almost every way imaginable. I mean, I can count the ways. He had written a book, Why England Slept. Joe had tried to write a book about the troubled civil war in Spain. He was a war hero. His father had come to him for advice on what he should do to rehabilitate his reputation. The ambassador was an appeaser. He comes to his 22-year-old son and asked for some memos to write some stories about rehabilitating his position. Symbolically, at the very end, he had passed his brother in rank. He was a lieutenant, and his brother, Joe Jr., was lieutenant junior grade. He had passed him in all respects. And I think by the time Joe died, I think his father had decided to let them both, determine their own future and not put all his resources behind Joe. So I think that's a big myth that until Joe died in the plane crash World War II, he was the one tapped to be, groomed to be president.
I mean, that's World War II was very unfortunate. It took a hit on everybody back then. One of the big things that like I have always heard throughout my life, is in stuff that I've read, but I really like history, is that, he was really smart but careless, kind of like a nonconformist, because especially, some of what he did stuck out like a sore thumb compared to the rest of the family.
Yeah, certainly after well, I'm not sure what ways are you kind of talking about. He's certainly reckless with terms of, I guess women, but so was his brother. They took after his father. He was certainly reckless and was a rebel in high school. I agree with you there. He did certain things during the war that were a little bit reckless. For an example, he always wanted to get his PT boat back to port quickly so they could, so he loved speed. So he'd drive that boat back to the gasoline dock, that's all the other boats, so they could fill up first so his men would have more time off. But that was a little reckless because he's roaring down there and he puts the PT boat 109 in reverse and ran into the shed. It's an example of being reckless. He's trying to help his men out, but certainly an example of being reckless in that regard.
Let's take a quick break.
The MiddleGround Mic isn't just another podcast. It's a movement for unity, for truth, for a future beyond the left and the right. But movements don't grow without people willing to stand up. Subscribe now on Buzzsprout. Fuel this mission directly on PayPal. Every subscription keeps the fire burning. The links are in the show notes. Be more than a listener. Be part of the middle ground. Yeah, early on, he was really good at building coalitions, like kind of formed early on in life. It kind of carried over into politics.
Yeah, well, certainly you could say, he was, when he was in high school, formed this group, the Muckers, who just created a little mischief there. So he became this charismatic leader and people followed him around. So I guess you could say he grouped a bunch of, of his classmates together to form a coalition in a certain sense. And I think his first, once you're a skipper of a T-boat, I think that was his first really example of being leadership. You've got to coalesce them and make sure they do what you ask them to do. But he got in there and, helped fix the boat. I think he was a key person making sure the ship ran efficiently. And his crew members always said he was an excellent skipper.
Yeah. I mean, that's a lot of people looked up to him. But, kind of like, going in like a little bit about his early years, like you said, that age range for, your book. He had a strained relationship with his father for a long time. Could you elaborate on that for everybody?
Well, it was, it had positive aspects as well as, uh, you know, difficult part of it also. Joe Kennedy wanted to anyone in the family, it was win or second place is for losers. So he always put that pressure on his sons to win. They'd go to a boat race out in wherever, Cape Cod or Martha's Vineyard. They came in second or third, and he'd read them the riot act. So second place was for losers. On the other hand, he really wanted them to experience as much as possible, life as much as possible. So after high school, he sent both his older brother Joe and Jack to England to study under a socialist, Joseph Lasky. So you kind of wouldn't expect that, but he wanted the best for his sons. But he certainly put a lot of pressure on them. He would do anything possible. Jack wrote the book 1940 that came out of his master's thesis while England slept, and it was a bestseller. Well, it was a bestseller because Joe Kennedy bought thousands of them. So he would do anything to make his sons successful. He was hard on them. So, you got both things going there.
Yeah, and it's hard, especially when you're clashing with your parents. I mean, nobody wants to clash with their parents. That's just, it's not an easy thing to do, especially when you're in that kind of a family. I mean, that pressure's, even more immense.
Right.
Well, you explained a lot, like, how a lot of this stuff kind of strengthened or formed his foreign policy stance as he got older and matured throughout life.
Well, the book is just, 18 to 29. So I think the one thing that formed his sort of ideas of in terms of foreign policy, one thing was right on the eve of World War II is traveling through Europe, and he goes from England, he goes to Russia, he goes to Germany, he goes to Hungary, he goes to France, he goes to Romania. He ends up Turkey, he goes to the Middle East. He ends up in the Middle East. And the last thing he sort of sees before he heads back is, the Arabs and, Jews fighting. So I think that, that informed his policies. He saw war as, he was in the middle of the war. And I think he, saw how terrible it was. And anybody who goes through war, I think informs their the rest of their life. And he hoped the world would never come to something like that again. And I think that informed, what happened during the Cuban Missile Crisis. He wanted to avoid anything resembling another world war. So he, did everything could to prevent that. And ultimately he was successful. He did travel to France, to Vietnam, and right after the French were still involved, and he could sort of see things were very difficult for the French. And although he went into Vietnam to a certain extent, I think in his second term he would have pulled out because he saw what was happening there, that colonialism didn't work. But of course, again, we'll never know.
Yeah, his father's worldview, at least from my understanding, is more of an, I won't say isolationist, but avoid war at all costs possible.
Right. He definitely was an appeaser, and he took it hard from the U.S. as well as, the Allies. He did it in just sort of a sense of he was a businessman. This war is to hurt business, so we should just stay out of it no matter what. And that was his view. And so he was very unpopular. But it's funny, he came to visit Jack at Stanford. Jack was auditing courses there. His book had already come out, and he comes to tell his son that he's getting ready to resign as ambassador to England. And that's a surprise to Jack. And then he asked his son to, as I said before, help rehabilitate his reputation and also write his memoirs. So, I don't think Jack, the ambassador ever really recovered, but, Joe sort of superseded him, and he gave all his attention to Jack to helping him with his political career.
Yeah, and that kind of feeds into lessons that he learned from dictators. That seems to be like a big thing. Like some of his experiences. Like he's pretty highly attuned to propaganda and how fear can control people, and it kind of parallels today. Like his skepticism towards like a lot of political theater per se.
Yeah,
like how,
he was right in the middle of Germany on the eve of World War II, and he saw how rabid people were for Hitler. I mean, one time they're driving around. This time he was with a couple of buddies, and they stopped at this statue, just kind of a martyr for Hitler made this guy a martyr who was killed by the communists, and they just stopped there. And And suddenly this crowd starts coming after him, throwing rocks at him. The police are coming after him. And the reason was it had English license plates. But, he was spat on in Germany, and, he saw just, a lot of horrible things there. He was in Russia, which was, controlled by Stalin at that point. And so he saw a lot of dictatorships during that time.
Yeah, and the world definitely seems to be, and why I think your book's important, and hopefully people can learn some of those lessons, is it feels like the world's heading more in that direction again, an authoritarian, and that, and it just did not work out well for the world last time.
That's right. I mean, there's only 4 communist countries, but I haven't done a total, but it would be interesting to sort of total up the totalitarian countries or ones that have moved to authoritarianism like this country has, and how many sort of democracies there are. It seems like you're definitely moving to that populist way, and the way you could say it kind of mirrors World War II. We have, hey, Putin coming in and, invading Ukraine. It's sort of similar to Germany invading other countries. So sort of a bad omen, but doesn't mean things have to turn out the same.
Yeah, no, it doesn't. In this country, it's kind of, it's funny. I always kind of joke. I'm like, it just seems like ever since Bush Jr. or W, depending how you want to call him, it's been like a competition between the last several presidents about who can sign the most executive orders. Each one has to outdo the other. And, party per se aside, a lot of people don't realize is that's essentially like a competition to see how fast we can get to the executive branch pretty much calling every single shot, almost rendering Congress useless. They really wouldn't be able to physically unless they had like a coup, but, it's pushing in that direction. And that's very scary. And men like JFK, they stood against things like that because you can't have one set of ideals dominating constantly forever. And when people say today, I want my guy in there, or when my guy does it, it's okay. And it's like, remember, you're okay with your guy doing it, but at some point the other guy's going to be in charge and he's going to do exactly what you don't want him to do out of spite. And now we just kind of seen that tit for tat, and JFK with his influence and just like his stamina that at least he had the outward appearance of, even though he may have struggled, it really, to me, it helped him. Just from historical, just looking at it, help balance things.
Yeah, I mean, he tried to work with Congress, certainly. There's no sense of not trying to work with Congress, So we'll just have to see what happens. But, he believed in the, separation of powers and Supreme Court and executive branch and, let things play out. He wasn't going to do anything like Trump's doing and try and, send in the police everywhere. So a totally different person. We're in a new age here, so we'll have to see how it plays out.
We definitely are in a new age. It's, I think I had elaborated this on one of my early shows, and it's something it's something that's really weighed on me over the past, probably since Trump took his first term. And, a lot of people may not realize in his first term, even though he obviously was not a traditional president, behind the scenes, things operated like a traditional situation, whereas now it is not. It is, he got rid of a lot of the traditional people that ran things a traditional way. He's doing it more of
because they disagreed with him. That's all.
Yeah.
And then switched to all. I don't care how competent you are.
Yes,
as long as you're a loyalist, you're hired. That's the key difference. You got to be a loyalist. So that's like a monarchy, or it's like a dictatorship.
Yeah, I tell people I'm in business, and I tell people I'm like I don't want people who are going to tell me what I want to hear. I want people who are going to look me in the face and go, F you. All right, let's figure it out. You've got to be able to have that with the people around you if you want true honesty from the people that surround you. Because if you don't, I mean, look at Stalin. What they said, he laid dead for a couple hours or a half a day or something because people were afraid to go in there. Yeah, it was. I don't know if he was having health problems or whatever, but I know I was watching. I don't know how it appeared on my Facebook the other day, but I just did an episode with a young lady on Russia a couple of weeks ago, and so he was dead for a while, or pretty much there, and they didn't want to go in because if he didn't give you explicit permission to come in at a certain time, even if you were like the most loyal person to him forever, if you violated that, you're automatically shot. So, and JFK was like the opposite of that, like he just from I didn't read like your whole book, but I read like a lot of, some of the quotes and highlights and stuff of it. He just kind of really to buck that trend, right? Like he wanted to create a culture of openness.
Yeah. Well, like I said, I don't, the book just goes to when he's 29, so he just elected to Congress. So I
Yeah.
don't investigate, generally aware of what he did and things he tried to do, and the space program and civil rights.
Oh yeah, that's later on stuff.
Right.
Yeah.
So I don't
You
go
know,
into that.
Scott Poole assumed his worldview came from privilege. Based on your book, his early on in life, the research shows it came from watching democracies collapse or struggle. What surprised you about his time in Europe? That maybe you wouldn't have thought from the outside looking in.
Yeah, I mean, he just had this world view that you get from traveling, and that's something that, whatever W never did. I don't think Trump has ever did, just to learn how other people live. What are their concerns? So, he's going throughout Europe and he's, gathering material. He has two sort of tasks when he goes to Europe in 1939, just on the eve of World War II. One is to gather the research for his book. He's doing his thesis for Harvard that turned into a book. And the other is to be his eyes and ears for his father. And so he has two things to do there, quite a task to do. But he sees what's going on in Germany. He asks her, he's very curious. So he picks up all these hitchhikers, German soldiers who leave in Italy. He picks up, all these people. He wants to talk with them, find out what they believe. And he talks to the French, and they believe they're safe. We can stop them, and they're not going to go cross our borders. So he's very curious. He wants to learn as much as possible. So I really, kind of respect him for that. He wasn't there just on a, an adventure trip. He got plenty of beach time while he was there, but he was there on a television.
Yeah, no, talking about the mission stuff, the PT, right? Kind of like the thing that forged a leader per se, right? Some of the things, like he regularly, or at least tried to regularly volunteer for dangerous duty. He commanded the PT-109 small torpedo boat, and the Pacific was brutal, high casualties, harsh conditions, but it seemed like, one of the things that when you look at him, he wanted to lead from the front, which when you look at when a lot of people talk about leadership, right, they talk about, people who don't, people lead from the back, people don't want to work as hard for, right? But if you're up there fighting with your men, like a lot of the generals did during the revolution, you're going to get a lot more out of your men.
Yeah. Well, yeah, when he first took over PT-109, it was this boat dilapidated. It wasn't worthy of going out in the seas. And so he pulled the crew together and he got in there with them to fix up the boat, painting and scraping the hull and everything else. So he realized that was a key thing to do to get the respect of his men. People say, and I tend to agree, that without, what happened with PT-109, he never would have been president. But there's, sort of a story there. There's a certain mythology regarding PT-109 and what happened there on that night in August. I recently found some things that, when he came back and he was finally rescued, he and his men were rescued, although two were killed in the collision with the Japanese ship. He said, they're either going to court-martial me or give me a medal.
Yeah, no, I mean, it makes total sense. He, his boss.
But most people don't know about that, that why would they court-martial him? Before the crash, it was, he was out, it was the only battle he was in. He wasn't actually in the battle. There's supposed to be a picket line to destroy Japanese shipping that was supposed to come through. So at some point, his men weren't alert. Few were sleeping, and he only had one engine going. And that's always been a controversy, that only had one engine going. Why did he only have one engine going? There's a certain reason for it, that in the previous times he went on patrol, these Japanese float planes would come over, and if you have three engines going, there's this giant phosphorescence coming out of your back, and the Japanese planes can see it. They can see where you are, and they can target your boat. And they went after him a couple of times, and he got hit. A couple of his men were injured, and so he made the decision to go to, when he was idling, to go to one engine, less phosphorescent. Some of the other captains did it too. It's kind of up to you to decide what to do. So on this night, at 12 o'clock in the morning, or 12:01, he receives, this only recently I found this out, he receives a note that says there are Japanese destroyers in the area.
Jeez.
So you would think at this point, you would go to three engines. And he does it. And that he only, he says this in 1946 in this memo that I only recently found. So why he didn't go to three engines, I don't know. But I think we could, if he'd had three engines going, he would have had a chance to avoid the destroyer. One engine sputtered a little bit, yet he had kind of no chance. The only PT boat has been rammed during World War II. But then afterward, I think that led to a certain guilt on his part. I think he felt like he was responsible, and I think he sort of was. And he, put it on his shoulders to do everything possible to get his men to safety. He did certain reckless things, heroic things to get his men to safety. And, when he finally brought his men back, at that point, the war effort, they wanted war heroes. So they decided, we'll skip this part beforehand and all the part you did afterwards, saving your men, making contact, going out in the middle of the ocean there 5 times, shark-infested waters, Japanese patrol boats, just going above and beyond what you'd expect someone to do. He became a war hero. And I think he always felt guilty about that. After they gave him another PT boat afterwards. It was one of these boats where they took off the torpedoes and they made it basically a battleship. So there's guns everywhere. And, I think he still felt guilty, and he came up with some sort of reckless ideas to invade an island held by the Japanese. His second in command disabused him of doing that. He kind of told his men to train his machine guns on a Japanese barge that was empty. So I think he always felt guilty about that. Even when he was running for Congress, his father wanted him to, emphasize his, war heroism. And he refused. He refused again and again. Finally, he gave in. And I think he didn't consider himself a war hero. Finally, he gave in, and his father published.
No, I mean,
I lost you.
I can see you still. Can you see me? I still got you on my end. No problem.
I don't see you.
Can you see me now?
No, let's see. Should I go back? Because I got phone coming in. Joseph, I'm not sure what to do here. We just continue on?
Yeah,
might as well.
Yeah, because I can still see the video on my end, so it's recording video.
Okay, that's fine. Okay, I can't see you. I don't know why, but anyway.
Yeah, that's just kind of weird. One of the things with him is, his early congressional priorities, right? This is his early on life, kind of towards the middle/end of your book, if I remember when I was looking at some of it. One of the things that really stuck out to me was how some of his like you're talking about his dad, right? The anti-appeasement stance. Those things kind of carried over into the Cold War, and the debates surrounded around that. And I think that, could you maybe elaborate why, some of those things maybe gave him such a strong interest in foreign policy, unusual for a freshman congressman?
Yeah, I think he was always, interested. So that was always a kind of interest in his life. His father wanted him to run for something like lieutenant governor of Massachusetts. And he didn't want to sort of deal with, these domestic problems. He was more interested in the world at large. He wrote that book, Why England Slept. So he was always interested in the world at large. And I think he recognized pretty much in 1946 that, the Cold War was coming, and that our, formidable foe was going to be communism in Russia. And so he was always interested in that. And, I think he was kind of ready after 3 terms in Congress, and he was in his second term in the Senate. He was ready with foreign policy experience to handle the crisis that came before him. And, of course, the Cuban Missile Crisis is one. The Bay of Pigs, I think he certainly a mistake on his part, and he learned from that. And that's why I think, his generals, he never trusted generals after the Bay of Pigs. And I think the generals certainly would have said, like they did with Johnson, to expand the war in Vietnam. But Kennedy never trusted the generals after the Bay of Pigs. So that's where I think he would have not allowed us to become enmeshed in, escalate the war in Vietnam.
Yeah, it's what did Eisenhower say? He warned us of that. Warned us of the military-industrial complex. And it's always very telling when a sitting president, especially one of somebody like Eisenhower's stature, would say something like that. Especially a guy of military. Both of them kind of watching something of that nature.
Well, it was surprising. That's something that's sort of important for us to remember. We can see it even today. It doesn't sound like Trump's listening to that, blowing up whatever boat he sees in the ocean, Venezuelan boats. But it's a difficult thing. I mean, we make these spend a lot of money on the military, and I think part of it is, they feel like they have to use it, have to, be the bully.
Yeah, I mean, it's the Venezuela one. I just did an episode with a gentleman named Ron B. Great guy. He negotiated some of the arms treaties in the 80s with Soviets. And talking about Venezuela, it's very similar to JFK talking about Venezuela. Is you know Fidel Castro took power, Bay of Pigs trying to get rid of him and all that. Moraro down there in Venezuela, I believe, not this last election, the election before that, he had actually lost the election and refused to leave office. And then, this last one, technically he won, but it was kind of like one of those communist ones where there's other choices, but you really only have one choice or else type of thing. And, now there's a lot coming out saying, I don't know how true it is, saying that Mararo's linked with some of the cartels down there in Venezuela. Don't know how true that part is, but it was very interesting because it's Ron was talking about, not like deja vu, but it's, since almost the JFK days, this is our biggest presence and buildup in that, region of the world. Yeah, I mean, it's, but it's, the real JFK, right? What, flaws, obviously it's pretty well known if you've ever been outside of or watch any sort of history thing with him, that he had issue, as a womanizer to a degree, right? He liked women, and what was maybe some of like the flaws or even some of the good things that you learned about him that maybe just don't seem to stand out to the general public?
Yeah. Yeah, I did see his flaws. And one thing, you don't think of JFK as being cheap, but he was a guy that, you wouldn't carry pay from. He'd sort of forget to pay him back. It sort of came from his father, who was rich but cheap. Sort of doesn't make sense. You have all this money, somehow you're still cheap. So that was, certainly a flaw. He was a womanizer. Certainly, that's something he learned from his father, who, had a lot of affairs with Hollywood women. And JFK always had a fascination with Hollywood women, with Marlene Dietrich, he had an affair with Sonia Heine. When he'd go out to Los Angeles, he palled around with Robert Stack. And, so he was always, sort of after women. And just sort of in a physical sense. And he was a guy also that surprised me to learn that he wasn't a person that had a lot of empathy. So he was, basically narcissistic. He wasn't a guy you would ask for favors. So I need help with this, need help with that. Privileged youth, whatever you want to call it. But he wasn't a guy you sort of asked for a favor. So those are certainly flaws there. But he's very charismatic and very funny, very witty, great to be around. People gravitated toward him. Like anybody, he has his good parts and his bad parts.
Yeah, I mean, it's it's always frustrating when you see like that. But the legacy and the lessons, right? Like, what can modern America learn from a young JFK as we navigate through some crazy times?
Yeah. The things I admire about JFK are his willingness to listen to other people, listen to other sides. We certainly don't see that today. I think also young people can admire his persistence in the face of so many problems he had, certainly with his health. It's interesting to read about even his sibling rivalry. I mean, a lot of brothers have that. I have that. I mean, he sort of surmounted that. I think those are two things. He was very curious. So if we can learn, just to be curious, stay curious, persistence in the face of obstacles, I think that can help any young person achieve what they want to achieve.
Yeah, I mean, I believe one thing that you had said is like the humility creates trust. He didn't brag about a lot of things. He seemed to always kind of underplay some of his, key accomplishments, and he gained the loyalty, like being relatable, and that's just, yeah, I think like love or hate Donald Trump. That's a lot of the working class related to the we don't feel like we're being put first rhetoric. Like we feel like we're being treated as secondary, and a lot of people bought into it. But JFK's was definitely a lot more authentic, in his actions.
Yeah, he wasn't. That was something very positive about him, even as president, even as a boy, even as a congressman, even as captain of a PT boat. Yeah, he wasn't a braggart. So I really kind of admired that. People wanted to laud him as a war hero, and he said, they asked him why was he a war hero? He said, well, they sank my boat. So, Trump might say, well, I saved all my men and I was heroic and everything, but JFK didn't do that. So, he had a certain shyness about him, but he wasn't a braggart. He had, great confidence in himself, a quiet confidence, which, I appreciate as opposed to someone who's a braggart.
Yeah, I mean, it's to me one of his most important features, and because humility when you're a leader just has to be key. Because without it, because your job, especially when you're in politics, right? You got to relate to everybody around you to some degree. You got to, because we, no matter what side of the aisle you're on, we all occupy the same dirt, same air, eat the same food, from the same dirt, and it's just he seemed to have like a knack for that, and it's that to me that feeds over into his signs over ambition, right? He rejected privilege's easy path, but he or not science over, I'm sorry, service over ambition. I don't know why I said that. He honored his brother's legacy. He chose duty over, comfort and privilege being easy.
Right. He didn't have to go to war. And actually, he had to, get a little help from his father who pulled some strings so he could be serve in the Navy. He was being trained in Belleville, but they didn't want to send him to war. And he really lobbied hard and used his connections so he could serve, in battle duty. So other people like whatever Bush or Trump, they're using every excuse to get out of it. But he's pulling strings to get in. So a different kind of person there, I think, I mean, you certainly made me thinking at that point of political future, and it looks a lot better if you're serving in the military and in battle as opposed to administrative jobs. There's always that calculation. He wanted to be where the action was. I could say that about Kennedy. He always wanted to be where the action was, whether it was serving in the war or running for Congress or traveling throughout Europe, with all those experiences, he wanted to be where the action was.
Yeah, I mean, it's kind of why he still matters, right? Leadership in this country and really around the world, it's in crisis. He was optimism with, his optimism was rooted in realism, and just and being real about things. And, he was willing to grow and change, and you've argued, we need this model again.
Yeah. Well, one example, I mean, it's not in my book, but I don't know if you're aware of Bay of Pigs. He went on TV and he took responsibility. Trump would do, his playbook is do just the opposite, is to attack, to never say, you lost or you're wrong. So, it's incredible contrast. But for a president to go on and say, buck stops here and I made the mistake, and it's something that is difficult to do, but he did it. And, I think we still respect him for that.
Yeah. And it's his early years, really kind of offer a blueprint for leaders of the future. If we want to come back together as a country and be a world leader again, we need some of those lessons to be really ingrained in the younger generations. One thing that stands out, is he was Catholic, and he took a lot of pride in that. At least from my knowledge, I don't know like how true it is. Just from my knowledge, he was a devout Catholic per se, at least in word. And something that stuck out to me recently, there was a Yale poll, Gen Z from 18 to 21 years old, like that group right there. It's now going to church at a faster pace, like more per person. Like they show up than every generation since the greatest generation of JFK. The last two generations didn't, and still don't go to church as much as that generation in Gen Z. So it feels like, to a degree, I don't know, are things coming full circle again and it's just a matter of time?
Yeah, I suppose people are sort of looking for some sort of faith. I mean, the world is in such difficult times. There seems to be, crises everywhere, climate change sort of looming over things. People are looking for something to put their faith in, and their religion can work for some people. Other people find something else to do that gives them faith, that gives them positivity. I'm up for anybody doing that.
Yeah. And we just need more of it. Scott, tell, as we wind down here, tell people like, what is the biggest thing, like, because your book, anybody that really wants to like dig in and get it, like really dig in, like what is the biggest attraction for a reader to go in and check that out?
He and the family, 99% or 90% have to do with, his time as president, have to do with Jackie, have to do with the assassination. So here's a book, that goes all the way back to when he's 18 years old. And well, the book starts out when he's in jail. How did that happen? But it's more than that he was in jail. It was a kind of a defining moment for him. So I'll let people buy the book and decide for themselves. And this period 18 and 29 is the defining period for him, where he learns to be a man. He learns to separate from his brother. He learns what it means to be a PT boat skipper and to save his men. He learns how to be a politician even before he runs for Congress. So I think those are key things. I have to say the book has some incredible photos. I don't know if you've glanced through it, but there's some very rare photos of him. One of them you have to see. I don't know if you noticed when he's in Florida and he's 18 years old and he's at a zoo and he has a python wrapped around his neck and he's in his underwear. There's band-aids on him. He's juggling in Germany during his travels through Nazi Germany. So there's incredible photos there, but it's just this picture of Kennedy is frozen in time as the president. Well, what was he like before then? And I think you've given a pretty extensive research, did well on what he was like that led him to become, this famous president, legendary president, iconic president.
No, most definitely. Scott, I really appreciate you coming on today. It was, JFK is one of the most important figures in our country's history. And I feel like everybody right now, like almost everybody going through Congress, should sit there and have to watch about things like the Bay of Pigs and, like really in the Cuban Missile Crisis, to just really understand, like, hey, this is how we can remember that we're America, right? Like the Bay of Pigs, like going on there, taking not apologies, but like taking responsibility. You know what I mean? And that's just, like Congress, things like that. I don't know why, but it just seems like when you get a job, right? You got to go through an orientation. Seems like, some of these things should be in their orientation packet.
What JFK did, this president's certainly not going to do it, but maybe people in the Congress could think about, what he was like and not try and copy him, but learn from him. It couldn't hurt.
No, not at all. I really appreciate you helping us peel back decades of things that people maybe didn't understand. You either generally, depending who you are, right? You're either going to be pro something, against something. The History Channel, it does a good job of getting the ideas out there, but it doesn't always go into the nitty gritty like you do. It just kind of go out through generalizations.
Yeah. Well, thank you for inviting me on. It's been a pleasure to talk with you. And, I've learned a lot, talking with you also. So I appreciate the chance to come on your show.
Yeah. To everybody, subscribe to us on YouTube, follow on Spotify, sign up for the newsletter. We usually send 1 to 2 out a week, depending on the latest crisis, what goes on. And, grab Scott's book, Becoming JFK. If you want the full story, it's at scottbadler.net, right?
It's on bookstores everywhere. So, yeah.
Yeah, everybody check it out. The link will be in the show notes, which we've started to make, we send out a lot more show notes and things now. We also do, whenever I do kind of like an independent monologue, whatever you want to call it, I put out fact sheets now where I get all my information. People seem to really love that kind of stuff. So, your stuff's going to be in the show notes. People love checking that stuff out. Everybody check it out. And I thank everybody for tuning in.
Okay. Thank you very much.
Thank you.